feel like I'm always low, like reliably.
Yeah. If Michael were here, he would say, "Eat the mic.
Eat the mic.
Eat the mic."
Which is dirty, Michael. Come on.
I get into this like monotone set, and sometimes I realize that I have another voice that I can use. So if it's real low, I'll like settle into that low.
I know the only reason you do this podcast is because you're fishing for a job on NPR. Like
I
in my old Kentucky home.
One. Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Kentucky Commons Radio Hour. Today I'm joined by John Renane, as always.
hello.
And a special guest, Tommy Johns.
Hello.
Hi. We won't have Michael Muller on today, unfortunately. We did just get back from a trip and he's feeling a little under the weather, so he'll be back next week. Don't worry. But if you want to see all our lovely faces, please pitch into the Patreon online. You'll get a full video feed of everything that we're doing here and hanging out in the shop at Brewgrass Homebrew Supply. And if you're listening to this and have 5 seconds, please just drop a 5-star review. Let us know how you feel about this.
Yeah, we're curious about where most of you guys are listening to this podcast. So leave us a comment if you're seeing this on social media, or if you're on a podcast app, drop a little review. Let us know you're out there.
Yeah, some content coming out that we have is we did go up to the Great Taste of the Midwest. That's a major beer festival put on by the Midwestern Homebrewers and Tasters Guild. Was a really fantastic time. We did take a quick detour in Chicago and met up with the folks from Revolution. So we'll have a special episode debuting probably later this week. It'll be outside of our normal schedule, but it's a great episode. I think those guys were amazing to talk to and had a lot of insight. So keep your eye out for that. That'll be a really fun episode to kind of divulge into a little bit more of the barrel culture that we've been talking about for some time. Let's get this thing started. I mean, John, what are we drinking?
So, I think what we're going to crack, since you were talking about your fantastic trip, is some Wisconsin beer, and there's no more Wisconsin beer than New Glarus Brewing Company. We've got the Totally Naked, which is their pure and crisp beer with nothing to hide, a Wisconsin 2-row barley malt, ensures mellow and smooth body, noble hops. And this is, I think, to style, just a Czech Pilsner, right? Yeah, just a Czech Pilsner, which if you guys have had New Glarus, you know that this is going to be fantastic. And if you haven't, you should.
Yeah, New Glarus is one of those unique brands that's only distributed in Wisconsin. You can only get it there, similar to like our West 6 in Kentucky. So they're employee owned, also similar to West 6, and they have a major presence there, and they make some really, really stand out and very consistent beers. So always glad when anyone goes up there to get a haul and bring those back.
Indeed.
Because they are very good.
So before tasting notes, would you like to introduce our guest so he can give tasting notes in context?
Certainly. Tommy Johns, we have the co-founder of Neon Bites. You talk a little bit about Neon Bites real quick?
Yeah, sure. So Neon Bites, we serve in a couple of different capacities throughout the food and beverage industry, primarily in the context of supporting messaging strategies for breweries, for distilleries, for restaurants, and that's in the means both of developing a messaging strategy, but also just thinking creatively about how to visually communicate the work that they're doing, and also just developing visual content in a multimodal kind of capacity. So lots of different formats, primarily through videography, so primarily through branded documentary, as well as commercial and narrative work, and then of course plenty of photography and some motion graphic style kinds of communication as well.
I've gotten into saying, like, and just I've seen some of your all's work, and it's fantastic. You know, people say like you taste with your eyes first,
Sure.
And that's true. But these days you almost kind of do taste with your like Instagram reels first, or your like random YouTube documentary you come across first. Like that's many people's first introduction to a brand, rather than seeing it on the shelf at a store or at a restaurant. New Glarus is a great example of that, because a lot of people, they've got a reputation, and that's well earned. But they also do a good job of like being a Wisconsin brewery that everybody in the USA like pursues their product, because they know the story, they know the brand. And it seems like that's what you guys are really good at doing, is just figuring out how to like take a message and put it into a digestible bite-sized
Sure.
format.
Yeah. I definitely try to do my best to. So they're a great example of achieving exactly what you said. It's funny because I've noticed there have been a number of times throughout the past couple of years where that dynamic has kind of bitten me in the ass in travels. And what I mean by that is just it's funny to see. Sometimes you kind of anticipate a great trip and you do some research in advance of going to a place. And there have been a few times where I've gone to a restaurant or an establishment of some kind in anticipation of what I saw through their social presence. And, I guess the diplomatic way I would put it is that there was a disconnect. They were really hitting high marks on their Instagram reels, as you'd said, maybe a little bit less so on the actual food products. So somebody in the social media marketing department was doing a better job than the actual developer.
So you're saying that Big Mac that I see in the McDonald's commercials
that's a tremendous product. That one's always high performing.
Hell yeah. Yes, McDonald's lawyers. It's always perfect every time.
Is it as big as it used to be?
I don't know, man. Inflation, like what do they call the opposite of inflation? Where instead of making it
the problem
more
is
expensive, you just reduce the price or the
it's
volume.
the same size. It's just that everything else has gotten bigger.
Yeah. From when you were a kid getting a Happy Meal to today. Well, speaking of quality products, let's do some quick tasting notes on Totally Naked from New Glarus.
Great name.
Which is really just a way for David Satterley to show off that he was, in fact, a great taste, which we'll talk about in detail in a little bit here.
I'll take it.
You were welcome to join.
I know. So it's very light. There's not a ton of aroma going on, as there should not be in a beer of this style. A little bit of light hops on the nose, like that little kind of husky, grainy, barley, Pilsner-y thing that kind of comes through from really good German Pilsner malt.
It leans into that like Czech pale lager category, which is not often exhibited, I think.
Perfectly soft, smooth carb. Their water is so good up there that it plays perfectly with the style. Yes. That's why their Spotted Cow is so good too, I think, just because that water lends itself so good to those styles.
It's really fantastic. It reminds me a lot of almost if you stretched a hef, right? And I'm thinking kind of Weinstefana kind of family, a little bit of undertones of that kind of banana profile. But again, stretching that out, a kind of a more diminutive version of some of those profiles. But I'm a big fan of this.
Yeah, that's one, those ones you mentioned are like very in your face flavors, but everything about this to me is very subtle.
Yeah,
it's just very well put together.
Yep. Subtle, crushable.
Yeah, very crushable.
Yep,
and I gave us small pours, but we can definitely kill a 12 ounce of this between us. If you guys want a little more, I certainly do.
Happily.
But yeah, moving on from the tasting of the beer, we talked a little bit about the background of the company, but kind of what kind of projects are you guys focusing on these days? You said there's a lot of beverage stuff that you guys do. We could start there, or we could start with kind of anything interesting that you're doing that's new. What are you excited about these days?
Or if you want to be concise and start from the beginning.
From the beginning too, how you got into this whole thing.
You've been doing this for some time.
Yeah, so so you know very well a lot of my background, Mr. Satterley, but I started out in the food and bev space. So my first job when I was young was working in a fast casual concept. I worked at Penn Station when I was 16.
My first job.
Oh, great.
Great steak and potato, but a very similar idea.
Great places. So I kind of started in that world just as a professional thing. When I graduated from high school and was in college, I did some work at Humana. I kind of pursued, the archetypal, adult job. I spent a couple of years there, had a kind of moment of realizing that was not the place for me at all. Found my way back into food service because of the fact that it was just where my inherent interests were. So I helped open the Silver Dollar in 2011.
Nice.
Met a handful of really fantastic folks, a couple of people who have been really valuable mentors to me over the years. One of whom is Joe Phillips, for example, at Pints&Union and Common House Hall. Kind of grew from there into opening a couple of other places, helped in a consulting capacity and developing some identities and some positioning, if you will. And then simultaneously, over the course of that time, had also been pursuing kind of informally media, just digital media in general. So I grew up skateboarding, and natural companion subculture of that, of course, is somebody is always either filming or shooting photos of
100%.
that.
Yeah.
And so,
Usually at the same time.
yeah, exactly.
That's how you get those cool shots.
So, kind of slowly but surely, those two interest sets kind of collided. The video side of things always, for a lot of folks, I think, starts out as, so you have a friend who needs a music video, and you've got a camera. And
Yeah.
you make a no less than 1,000 atrocious music videos, and
In somebody's
eventually-
basement.
yeah. Eventually they start sucking a little bit less and a little bit less, and it's, long story short, I kind of found myself in a place where having an ownership position in what was Louis the Ton, which was that story, and Frankfurt Avenues, I kind of had that kind of collided or intersected a time frame when there was a really early push for restaurants to have their own social presence. And so I had a mandate then, by way of those responsibilities, to kind of take the lead on that work. So that was a pretty tremendous adaptive pressure.
If I can ask, maybe we could use Louis the Ton for an example,
Yeah.
but what is your day-to-day, what does your 9 to 5 look like on obviously it's not a 9 to 5 when you're doing this kind of work, but what do you do on an average day kind of in that role? What are your kind of priorities? What are you focusing on?
Well, so then it was a lot more straightforward, because that was very much a matter of, I was facilitating programming for that restaurant, or that bar rather, and the digital presence around it. And then also, because of the location, and especially because at the time there was a pretty limited amount of foot traffic, we had to go out of our way to create event programming to make it a destination. So we were learning the hard way and in real time how to reach and stretch, if you will. We were producing events just about every night of the week, and companion content to promote around them.
Mostly
And
in-house stuff?
Yeah, entirely in-house.
So really it sounds like obviously the basics there are just like web design, graphic design, kind of like theming of like branding and things like that.
Yeah, you got
kind
it.
of a voice for the copywriting.
Yep.
Do you do a lot of that yourself, or is that stuff you kind of outsource to team members?
So at that time I did all of those
Yeah.
things. And, that was really eye-opening, mostly in the fact that it made very clear which attributes of that bigger scope I was able to manage myself,
Yeah.
and which were most fitting for me to in scaling, to kind of delegate to other folks, and also just to kind of give to people who were significantly better at it than I was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So my day-to-day now, there is no such thing as like a normal day. I work in a lot of different arenas at this point. I work with a lot of different brands, and their needs and the means in which we engage with one another are pretty dramatically different across the board. So I work with a lot of distilleries, for example. I have relationships with a lot of brands that are strictly oriented to the development of content. And then I have others that are more in a consultative capacity. Just last week, I just finished doing a round of cocktails for Ale 8 for some summer punches.
That's cool.
That was, they engaged me both to create the actual menu, if you will, or the cocktail recipes, and then also companion content to promote that. So a lot of times I like to do stuff like that. That's kind of integral to multiple skill sets. But depending on what a given brand needs, sometimes it's more or less comprehensive. And so, that's an example of one thing I've been doing this week. Another thing I've been working on, kind of give you an idea of what the other end of the spectrum looks like, is project for the American Lamb Board, and they are an
Land board?
Lamb. So they work,
Lamb.
yeah,
Like,
so,
yes.
you got it. Yeah,
I was at the state fair earlier today, so it's
Yeah.
very fresh in my mind.
Yeah, so sustainability messaging for them, basically a national project. They're basically tasking us to create some messaging around how shepherding practices in that protein category are able to be sustainable from an ecological standpoint. So they've been sending us around the country to capture stories of people who are utilizing shepherding for the purpose of fire prevention, for their vineyard grazing, which basically they're sending the sheep around vineyards to mitigate the need for fossil fuel burning equipment. We went to Texas a couple of weeks ago to cover a vignette on a fellow who's doing a regenerative agriculture thing. And then a couple of weeks we'll go to New York to do one with solar grazing. So they've got the sheep grazing around solar arrays to maximize efficiency and minimize any kind of obstruction of this. So pretty dramatically different stuff,
Yeah,
to
totally.
say the least.
Yeah, you covered a lot there. So some of it, I think deserves a little more. Silver Dollar is like, pretty much widely renowned in the country as one of the best bourbon bars.
Yeah.
Being in Kentucky, being focused on that. And then you and I linked up at Louis the Ton, where I believe our first interaction was, can I have an old fashioned? To which you responded by handing me a book of 120 something old fashions. So
Make it yourself.
which one do you want?
Yeah.
That's that like elitist hipster attitude that you get at a really nice cocktail bar.
But I had a choice,
Well, I will say, just in thinking about the Silver Dollar, somebody else who's been really influential for me has been Susie Hoyt, who's been a part of the Silver Dollar from its opening. She runs the program there and the Pearl now, but she and also ran the program at El Camino when it was open. And my girlfriend Emily and I, we both worked there as well. I've been really fortunate to, especially since we opened that initially, I've kind of gone out of my way to pursue checking out tiki concepts or tiki programs around anywhere that I go. And I didn't realize until retrospectively that is by a landslide the most outrageous cocktail concept that I've seen anywhere. What that staff was actually doing is fucking insanity. It's I've never seen anywhere that has developed a training model for cocktails of that level of complexity at that volume.
You're talking
break
like
that down a little bit. Yeah.
big builds or
Yeah, so big pickups. You're talking in some cases 13 ingredient cocktails or more, and there are a couple of folks. My girlfriend Emily being one of them, who their ability to execute volume with that menu is I've never seen anything like that anywhere. So I've been to a couple of a number of really well-respected and celebrated tiki institutions around the country. Think about the Three Dots on the Dash or Lost Lake in Chicago, Smuggler's Cove in San Francisco. There's a handful of them, maybe a little bit less technically robust in Europe, but still a couple of them that are pretty well celebrated. And it's not to talk down on any of those, but they are mostly enjoying the advantage of existing in a larger market. The program that Susie had put together there, from both a technical proficiency standpoint in terms of the just precision of the profiles of those drinks, as well as the training program that she put together to empower some of those folks, so the people who kind of had the inherent skill set and nurtured it. It was laughable to go into a couple of places. I won't speak to anywhere in particular. We'll touch on one in particular, but there's a couple of places that I went where it's just like, these people are making one fucking drink at a time. Like, I'm losing my mind here. And some of the folks that were working service bar at El Camino could make these outrageously complex builds 5 or 6 tins at a time, which I'm talking in some instances, some of those would be 2-3 cocktails each. So you're making 10, 12, 15, theoretically up to like 18 drinks at once. And they're outrageously complex.
So almost like the Henry Ford of the tiki industry.
It's
like figuring out how to
crazy.
like take that.
I honestly, it's like I look back on it now and I just it's it's mind-boggling, just the perplexity of it. That just doesn't feel like the calculus works. It's
Yeah.
like that's not real.
Going back to the like in any of your projects, and I was just thinking about this with like the either tiki bars or even the lamb projects.
Yeah.
So when you get when you land one of these like projects, or even when you just go into a new place, if you were to start thinking about how you're going to create media, like how much time do you spend just kind of getting to know it and kind of figuring out what that story is, or does that just kind of present itself to you immediately? And then how much time between that and when you start kind of figuring out how to put the pieces together into what kind of a story you want to tell? And then how you decide to finally end up telling it.
Yeah, I mean, the answer, and it might not be particularly satisfying, but it always depends. A lot of the times, one of the things that I've found has really been valuable for me is, again, the fact that I'm integrating a lot of personal interests, and so I am fortunate enough to be paying a lot of attention to these things organically because I've just find meaning in them, right? Like I am actually naturally attracted to them. So a lot of times I'm able to kind of come into places and at least be a little bit ahead of somebody who might just come in there and is really great with taking photos or taking video, whatever it might be. Kind of two distinctly different skill sets, being one understanding the subject matter that you're looking at, the other one just the technical side of the actual discipline of media. So I've specifically made it a point to pursue stuff and pursue work that falls under that purview because I know that those two skill sets then lend themselves to one another, right? They both benefit because I probably am not nearly as good at the photography side of it as I feel like, or as I'm satisfied with at times, because it's probably more just I have a feel for what I'm looking at than
and
it
so
is.
it sounds to me like you have more of a personal approach than like an analytical approach to it. It's kind of like the Peggy Olson version of like whatever.
Yeah.
Like you're the product in some ways. It's how you're kind of feeling about it, how you're processing it, and then figuring out how to convey that information into something digestible that other people could understand as well. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is I feel like that's kind of the case for everybody. I may just be invested in being a little bit more honest about it or more explicit about it. However, not that I'm saying anybody is dishonest about it per se, so much as I feel like I don't see how we can like disentangle or detach or decouple those things from one another. I feel like anytime you're presenting an image, and especially anytime you're presenting a video in any way, and even more especially anytime you're doing anything that bears semblance to the format of documentary, whether that's branded or whether that's intended to be presented as more objective, it never is. It's always articulated through the prism of whomever is actually holding the controls.
Yeah. Is there, so you've been doing this a while in various spaces, but is there, since we're on the topic of just talking about like creative, is there any like rookie mistakes, like any like pitfalls to avoid for people trying to like, approach this space? Because you are an entrepreneur.
Don't start a podcast.
Yeah.
you built this, I mean, along with your team. But
I mean, I think the rookie mistake is inhabiting the mindset that you're a rookie, right? Like, I think shut that the fuck up. Like, don't let that stop you. Just, I think more than anything, it's just a matter of, none of the biggest rookie mistake that I can point to it in my view is just the tendency to like fail to give ourselves credibility for our potential, or for like buying into the myth of forgetting that like none of us understand anything intuitively, right? Like we as especially when we are nascent in any skill set, we have a tendency to beat ourselves up a little bit and say, oh well, look at compare ourselves to this person or that person. It's like, that fucking person doesn't know that intuitively, right? They just happen to have been granted access to a body of insights for which they are also not responsible.
Or they might just have a really good person managing their brand image.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Or even worse, they actually literally are a fraud.
Yeah. You don't want to fall into that Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah,
So kind of. So,
Or if you do, you might end up like president of a major corporation. So I don't know. It goes both ways.
Failing up has always been one of my favorite concepts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that whole kind of notion of of however you want to think about it, however you want to characterize it, whether it's Dunning-Kruger, whether it's that notion of being a fraud or being found out, imposter syndrome, whatever it is. I think that stuff is both something to kind of keep at arm's length, but also it's like it's a valuable thing if you can internalize it in a way that doesn't end up crippling you from putting another step forward, right? Keep yourself humbling. If it can be a gating mechanism in that way, then it's a good thing.
I think imposter syndrome is a total plague, especially among the millennial generation. You just have access to all of this content.
Sure.
It's in your face. It's a constant stream. You've heard the term like doom scrolling.
Yeah.
Heard
the term. Like it's my life.
I do it. but it's like I saw something the other day and it was just like, we weren't meant to hear everyone's opinion about everything all the time. And that imposter syndrome builds quickly, and it's vapid. It comes across, and you're talking about being like nascent and a skill, and it's okay to not know that you don't fucking know, because how could you know without knowing?
Yeah.
and we've faced that challenge with Louisville Ale Trail, with this podcast in itself. I mean, I think this podcast actually started about 2 years ago, and it was maybe closer to a year before we ever released anything.
Yeah.
and we look back on this and we're like, oh my God. But, just the fact that we got it started and got it rolling was more important than the fact of producing a premium, a refined product. And it just takes time.
Yeah, and
Ray
getting comfortable.
Bradbury used to say, or had written, like, just jump and build your wings on the way down.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
what it's like.
that's a perfect way of thinking about this too, because I feel like you made mention of the kind of scale of the number of social points of contact that we have that are made possible by the networked society, right? So you have in sociology, you have this notion of Dunbar's number, right? Mm-hmm. That talks about the kind of the number of realistic potential connections that you can kind of maintain. And that's something that's really fascinating to me, because we're all kind of fumbling through the dark as a culture together, trying to figure out, well, how do we reconcile that with the dynamic of what's possible here, of the number of people that we're exposed to on a daily basis. Not only is that the case, but we're specifically, the function of focus is something that that is an exception, not the rule to our nature. And so when you just put us in front of a group of social stimulation that's more than happy to take our attention, this is the natural outcome, right? We're not facing anything that's mysterious. I've actually had a couple of moments over the past couple of years of being kind of horrifically crippled by this notion of like the social panopticon and this fear of like, oh fuck, every time I like say anything on a social platform, I'm like terrified of like, hey, am I like wielding my responsibility here correctly? Not that I have any kind of disproportionate influence, but it's just literally I am crippled by the fear of like me saying anything that is in conflict with what somebody else has internalized or what somebody else kind of identifies with, and that rendering to this amorphous, abstract, hypothetical somebody.
Yeah, and I think that peaks when you factor in like virality.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
When like you're
if some
expressing
drunk hot take like goes viral, you're like, oh shit,
and then you're like, oh fuck, I did that. I mean, I've never enjoyed the panic of that experience, but
hey, that picture of you shirtless making waffles that one time.
That sounds like something to
I've
rally
that
around.
memory.
Yeah, you remember that? Okay.
Yeah, it's weird to try to kind of make sense of, hey, how do I dispense of this tool and of the like of what is made possible by being able to just open your fucking phone and speak to essentially everybody who you have any meaningful relationship with, and trying to also, I feel like there's the two extremes, right? I'm always like stunned by seeing the people who are comfortable just like throwing something out there that clearly is not going to fall consistently with how some people have characterized this individual. You have that kind of flagrancy, and I'm like, all right, I kind of wish I could do that, but there's no way that I can't like throw anything out there into a public domain that's not conscious of the fact that, like, hey, this is going to an obnoxiously eclectic mixed bag of people, like that some of these folks have like don't know anything about this version of me, right? Because we're all like 1,000 people at minimum.
I think this is where Bitcoin unites everyone.
Oh God.
Hey man, don't get me started.
No.
I know
But
nothing about that.
Doge.
I will bump into the show and tell segment on the
I'm not showing you my Bitcoin wallet.
One,
cannot see my
as
private key.
somebody who's interested in media, this is a quote that I am always puzzled by and like to meditate on. Does the medium is the message mean anything to you?
Oh man,
That's McLuhan, I think, who I can never tell if is a genius or a quack or both.
yeah, I feel like it's interesting that you point to that one in particular. I mean, yeah, I think more so. Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about kind of the metaphysics of language and philosophy, and for me, I think more so than anything, that resonates with me in a linguistic capacity in general. So, I think that specifically, that is historically attributed to this notion of
Like a la Wittgenstein kind of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what I'm kind of getting at with the McLuhan thing is that a lot of that's generally attributed to like him making some commentary around the way that that emerging
You're not watching I Love
technology-
Lucy, you're watching Burger King commercials.
Yeah,
Like
and
you're not watching The Tonight Show, you're watching like whatever NBC has decided to put in your face or whatever.
yeah, well, and so that's typically associated with this notion of kind of that emerging understanding of PR, right? And of the like, what's Freud's nephew guy? His name is, I forget what his name is now.
His nephew or his protege?
His nephew. His name is. Of course, I'll remember like in
That's the way that
any
goes.
second. But Edward Bernays is his
Okay,
name.
yeah.
He's generally associated with the development of public relations as an area of professional expertise, but that at its onset was the terminology that kind of it instantiated what we now understand just as advertising. And the McLuhan quote specifically talks about that emerging monolith of, as you said, right, of things like the Burger King commercials, right? So he's specifically commenting on the ability of those commercials to wield influence that occupies our subconscious, that dominates our internalization of our personal identity in a manner that is kind of hijacking our innate ability to kind of make sense of and be the
Intuition.
drivers of our own kind of decision-making processes by leveraging social external validation.
Yeah. Like in the 90s, like, I mean, and I'm a 90s kid. You guys are all kind of at the same age. Like, it's hard. It's hard to not sometimes think about your life in terms of like a TV show. Like kind of like a Truman Show vibe or something like that. Is like, how do we describe what our lives
You
are
mean
to
because we're
ourselves?
just seeing ourselves on fucking screens
Yeah, exactly.
every
So how
day,
does that
all
change
day?
in this digital world? Like, our kids, do kids have
Yeah.
a different notion of reality than we do? Or
Yeah.
we might view longer narratives being 30-minute narratives. Like, if
Sure.
God, who knows what the hell Dostoevsky thought about the world or like whatever. But I don't know. Does the does the medium change the psyche, or does the
I
psyche change the
definitely.
medium?
Yeah, I mean, if you frame that question in that way, I feel absolutely that's a big, it's like an indisputable yes in my view. And I
agree.
think it's interesting because it's
but
like,
they create each other too. It's like the Ouroboros, man.
exactly. Yeah. They're definitely self-perpetuating. I think that the information technology, the kind of historicity of information technology, is such that that's not anything that's new. The rate of change within that dynamic is most certainly accelerating. But I think that it's interesting to kind of be along for that ride. I'm really grateful for the fact that social media emerged just in time for us to, at least in my view, I feel like I made a clean escape. I can't imagine the horror of having to grow up and specifically go through the process of learning who the fuck you are.
I would get bummed out if nobody would chat with me on AOL Messenger like after school.
Well, but I mean, imagine also just like, I'm horrified by the idea of what it must be like to be younger at this moment in time, where if you fuck up, you're fucking up in a public domain, and now
it's non-erasable. It's permanent.
I'm grateful to have been able to have been a little bit more private in my youth. I definitely needed that.
I think if anyone wants to dig through my like 2007 MySpace comments, they'll probably find something.
If you want to dig through mine, get fucked. Don't you dare.
No, the Wayback. Nobody go to Wayback Machine and look up.
I've legally changed my name since then, just so you know.
Just to play it safe. Good move.
But the youth like live in these three perceptions of like their personal self, their internal self, and then their digital self.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's you can't really reconcile the three of those at a formative age and understand what you're becoming and who you are and all those things.
What are the three of those you said?
For me, it's the physical, what how you perceive to your peers around you.
Yeah.
The internal, how you look at yourself reflectively, and then the third being digital and how you perceive yourself online, which is obviously a facade.
Interesting. I've never heard that described that way before. That's very interesting.
I think that I think that you kind of point to something that's actually admirable or a positive in my view, though, right? Like I think that the domain, like the digital domain, as much as it is a fabrication, I think that it's also just as real as these others, which isn't
paintings. Like,
right. I mean, the thing that is important to keep in mind is that we are both individually and as communities at whatever strata you want to think about that, right? Whether that's we, the three of us as a community here right now, whether that's as a city, as a nation, whatever identitarian angle you want to think about it as, right? What underpins all of that is stories, whether it's the story that we're telling ourselves about ourselves in order to reinforce our own identity, or whether it's what we're telling each other about, well, this is the glue that holds that group together. That same principle, I think that there's something really kind of special about the value of a digital identity as being this opportunity to deploy reflection and to articulate an aspirational version of ourselves, especially so long as we're all on the same page, as recognizing that is an aspirational version of ourselves, right? Rather than, I think rightfully you kind of alluded to the fact that, hey, a lot of people run with this and pervert it, and it ends up being a domain for misapprehension or dishonesty, and that's not something to be celebrated, I don't think. But I think that the reflective self is most certainly something that I think is worthy of consideration.
It's hard not to look at that painting, The Myth of Narcissus, where he's like going down into the water and just like imagining somebody like looking at an iPad of their own like TikToks or whatever. I don't know. It freaks me out.
Incredible.
I will say you have tried to make these references on every single podcast.
I know, this is my guy
this
right
is
here.
The first time this is
landed. This is great. This is
so
great.
good.
I'm just gonna give you like 10 seconds for a Jungian quote, because you always try and
what's
swing
an
them
applicable
in.
one here, man? I don't know. The thing that would resonate with me about that is that like we actually do like think in stories. That's the thing that I was thinking about like that, and I think that's more like maybe Adler or something than the Freud Jungian people, but like that's and to me that's what connects with that medium as a message thing. It's like your mom and dad tell you stories growing up living in a cave, and that just keeps happening, and the stories change and the characters change, and then that builds the archetypes, and then like that's how we think, like that's how we see the world, that's how we interpret things. Like, why is this a table and not a pallet that our grains came in on, which it's both at the same time. It's a table because we're using it this way. Like, and what is a cell phone? Like, what is Facebook? What is fucking
you're
TikTok?
Spot on too in terms of the kind of headspace that I occupy a lot of the times. I mean, these things are inseparably intertwined from the work that I do. Right? It's like, you know, the corporate job that I mentioned earlier, I left that out of horror.
Because it's not that.
The idea of what they were doing.
This is a phone. You use this phone to call people that owe you money, and you yell at them or like whatever.
And
I also
using extraction, all that stuff.
I worked that same place as you, and I remember the day that I got fired from there, and I was all sad, and I walked in, and you're like, high five. What do you mean? High five, I got fired. And you're like, no, fuck that place.
I you know, speaking of language, I remember the day that I fired myself from that place. As I specifically, I made that decision, and I remember deliberately giving no heads up to any of the parental people or any kind of anybody who held that kind of place in my life, because it's like, these motherfuckers are going to tell me to give them a notice. If I give these people a fucking notice, that means I set the stage for being able to crawl back to these assholes, and I'm not doing that.
Sure?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I did learn that in their corporate lexicon, they have, if you dig deeply enough, you'll find the words voluntary exit. So that was, I called my supervisor up and said, "Sir, I'm gonna deploy my right to voluntary exit effective an hour ago."
Yeah, I mean, Kentucky's a right to work state. It also could be a right to exit state.
Apparently,
as long as you're not going to Indiana. Like, let's keep it here in Kentucky. Let's segue that conversation maybe just into the beverage industry and then go into show and tell. But do any of these trends? Okay, let's do that first. Yeah.
So I mean, we talked enough. I would like to have another beer.
Okay, let's do it. There's backup beers around too if anybody needs one. You good?
Yeah, I'm good myself. Thank you. Is that to me? Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I
don't know what's in this.
Yeah, tell us.
I see a sticker that says Pints&union. I'm familiar with that.
Psilocybin tea.
Oh,
No.
well, this is
How long is this podcast?
27 hours.
And it'll be over in 11 minutes. So this is Shippingport Kölsch.
Oh yeah, dude.
And
friend of the show.
I brought this because, again, as I mentioned earlier, Joe Phillips is a mentor of mine, and I'm really enthusiastic. I'm starting to do some work with him again here recently. So they just went into Indiana, I guess this week, and I think Pints&union and
awesome.
Common House are the first two accounts to have them on. Joe's always been enthusiastic about using food and beverage as the kind of modality for creating community or as a conduit point for community.
What is beer? Yeah, exactly.
And Shippingport is a huge proponent of community as well.
Mm-hmm.
Getting beyond that 9th Street divide, we've always praised them for making that a possibility, really. They had the Fraser Beer Fest 2 weeks ago. They hosted the after party. I think they have an incredible vision of rebuilding sort of things west of the 9th. Sure. And on top of that, I mean, the beer is just like straightforward and great.
And the food and the staff and the people who drink there and hang out there.
It is truly community based. They thrive on that via pop-ups, via just small batch beers that they're working on. Some things that came out in the last couple of weeks was the Wasabi, which was a wasabi pea and jasmine tea.
So you like that, lager. But you hate Kyle Jan's horseradish vodka. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'll say the horseradish vodka was definitely a curveball. And I didn't know what it was, but I recently found out that most American wasabi is really just dyed horseradish.
God,
and if you eat the real stuff, you'll just snot out of your nose.
Oh, this real stuff is very hot.
Yeah. So I kind of want it now. But
it's not even like hot. It just like goes onto the back of your eyeballs and makes liquid come out.
I don't. If my
Direct channel of expulsion.
Clears your pineal gland. How about that?
Oh, no, I thought that was the toothpaste.
There you go. That's the tea.
That's the tea. Yeah, that's what we're about to do. All right. So, Shippingport, Kölsch.
Yeah,
is Eddy the name
Eddy.
of this one?
Yeah,
Eddy
You
Kölsch.
got it, yeah.
I made the mistake of asking when we had Amelia on the cast on the podcast. So what's Eddy about? And she's like, "Well, we're on the Ohio River. Do you not know what Eddy is?" And I was like, "I have a cousin Eddy. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about.
Is that your dog?
Yeah.
But it's when like water channels
dropping
around.
the geological terms on it. Yeah. All right.
Cheers.
Well,
Thank you.
Cheers, guys. Yeah, this is great. Good beer, good conversation.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And
I love that it's in Indiana now. Those two brands that you're talking about, Pints&Union and Common House, respectively, have always played a big notion to craft and import, and being very intentional about that in their branding. It really, like, for a while, probably still, but about on every Sunday we head over to Indiana because you do Louisville 5 days, 6 days out of the week. You go to Indiana on Sundays and see what's going on. There is a lot of stuff over there in Southern Indiana that's really worth visiting, and those are definitely top two on my list.
yeah.
Yeah, I agreed. I think so. I do a lot of work in like at least adjacent to the development space, and I think the round number that they kick around, who knows what this number, how accurate it is, but at least the number that I hear often is $13 billion of development money in the city right now.
Wow.
You think about what the implications are for that. You look at examples, bad one being Nashville, that has grown in a kind of offensively undesirable manner.
I kind of agree. Downtown Nashville stresses me out. So it's great.
I love to visit.
Yeah, that's
And
a good way to put it.
then I also love to leave. But there are some of the examples of places like Austin maybe being a better example of a more sustainable growth mechanism.
Unless you're talking about their power grid,
Right, yeah, and I
or
don't,
water.
I don't know that there's anywhere that's a perfect. So I think like what's interesting for us right now is I think that looking at Southern Indiana, and you've heard for years, and I'm it's not my place to comment where we are in this process or the degree to which it will or won't happen, but thinking about the idea of Southern Indiana as the Brooklyn of Louisville is a really romantic thought.
I always
to
like
me.
to refer to New Albany as the Tijuana of Louisville.
Yeah, I love that.
personally,
That's
but
great.
That was back when the old distribution laws were more heavily enforced. You could go over to Keg Liquor
Fantastic.
and you could get all the amazing beer that Indiana got that we couldn't get here.
It is.
That's
it's a
incredible.
silo.
And you might have come home with that. Well, I'll leave that there. You might come home with a little bit more than beer.
I think that there's I think we internalize a little bit more of a kind of an identitarian rift at this point, but I suspect that with that much development money, a responsible and like an ideal realization of growth looks a lot like integrating those neighborhoods more readily into our communities and kind of more normalizing the idea of crossing the bridge. I think obviously a lot more so than folks in Manhattan, for example, maybe do with Brooklyn.
Even the whatever they call it, the Big Four walking bridge or whatever, that's been such a great way to go experience Jeffersonville over there.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's Common House, and there's a ton of other great restaurants and bars and boutiques and coffee shops and ice cream. And you can go walk to the waterfront, and then it's like takes 15 minutes to walk across that bridge or something like
Yeah.
that, and then you're in downtown Jeff.
It's scenic.
Yeah.
I think I've said it more than once, but like having spent some time in Austin, it's like, what's Austin like? It's like, well, if Louisville and Southern Indiana merged, that would be Austin.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that what's interesting, I think about this a lot too, is like you think about the Portlands and the Austins of the world, and to a lesser extent, but arguably to some extent Nashville also. Their maturation as cities, I think, came about kind of at the end of a very distinct developmental era from the macroscopic viewpoint. I don't think you look at, like, for example, you look at some of these trends of actually deurbanization that are happening. A lot of, especially after the pandemic, a lot of young professionals kind of retreating back into rural settings, especially as remote work makes that more viable. And I think that probably has pretty profound implications for what the future of urban development and implicitly urban planning looks like. So I think that we're probably not on track to see as aggressive a kind of rush into these fledgling developing markets such as ourselves, or at least prospectively such as ourselves. If we were to realize the kind of maturation that one of those markets has, I don't think it would look the same because of those changes. And I'm really enthusiastic about what that could look like, because it in my view sounds like it could look a lot like a very tasteful and a very a better version of developing as a city, as opposed to just being
we have time to think about
suffocated.
it. We don't have to
exactly.
like be in a mad rush to like build stuff or whatever. And it's the middle way. You can't go the other direction or whatever. But yeah, I think Wolves in a really interesting spot as well. Like we've got a lot of potential.
And if we're being honest, there's a lot of city left.
Yeah,
to develop.
For sure.
Exactly.
There's a lot
to grow into,
a whole lot.
And I feel like the fact that we're doing it now, we're getting into this new kind of urban environment where instead of things coming top down, things are starting to get built more grassroots. To me, it feels like
sure.
So kind of giving communities like a chance to access resources to redevelop themselves instead of like being redeveloped.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Our take on at least the brewery side of things has always been like, there's a lot. There's more than there's ever been. We're seeing 50% growth year over year, but look at the places there aren't. And it's all like very concentrated. When you look at a map, it's right there, and you're just like, okay, so there's all this other space.
Well, Shippingport's a great example because like the nihilistic,
that's a start though.
Yeah, no. Well, yeah, exactly. You could look at that and say, oh, somebody's trying to come and put a brewery in Portland, but Amelia lives like right there.
Yeah,
like this is Amelia's neighborhood, and that's why she wanted it to do it there, because it's like, this is my community, and I want to build this for my neighbors, and I want it to be a place I can hang out with my friends and my neighbors. And she has succeeded. Like I wouldn't say beyond anyone's wildest dreams, because like it's exactly what I thought Amelia's brewery would look like.
Oh, and that's also that, in my view, always means like, hey, that means in that same spirit of what you're saying, there's lots of room to grow into, right?
Yeah.
It takes that innovator, that vision, the entrepreneur to really build upon that and do it, and do it the right way. And I think that like encompasses a lot of the conversation we have about being intentional and being, getting rid of some of those factors that stop you from your growth as far as
when you said that, I just started thinking about that, whatever phraseology we were using, where the like your imposter syndrome type thing. It's like, it's kind of the same thing with building new businesses up. It's like, no, you can start a business in your neighborhood. Like you really can. Like it's hard.
I also always think of building businesses as being a dialogue, right? And like you make the first move if you're the business founder or owner, but you then have to interface with the community or with your patronage, whatever that might look like for your business. And a lot of the times what I've seen with folks who I've had either direct or indirect relationship or insight to the dynamic of their business with, so some people make the mistake of being kind of falling, they indulge in fantasy, if you will, right? Their specific vision of their business is what they kind of try to force feed people, rather than
understanding,
recognizing, hey, okay, so here's where my vision was. Here's what the community tells me they actually want. How can I reconcile those two things? A lot of people just want to, we got to change this or that.
Similarly, my vision for that has always been a game of chess, right? So you start a pawn forward and you start that movement, and then how does it counter? Are they coming directly for your king?
Queen's Gambit.
Yeah. Is it coming out? If not, like, all right, well, then we'll start moving some other pieces in place. And then, and say you get checked every now and again. You made a turn. People
but that makes it sound more like Machiavellian than what you're trying to describe. It's not you versus the world. It's like So we said like the medium is the message. Here's another phrase that I think about all the time, and I don't know who said it, probably like Confucius or something, but the customer is always right. How do you guys feel about
Sounds
that
like
phrase?
a Confucian one. Fuck that. I hate that idea.
Okay, but how does that not resonate with what you're just saying? The customer is always right.
Oh, yeah.
You're coming into, you're opening a business.
So the reason that I think that doesn't resonate with what I was trying to get at there, right, is that so I think that the mentality there is about strictly proceeding and conducting your business from the standpoint, because this is essentially the counterpoint, right? The dichotomy of that, right? Like that suggests that do anything you can to make sure that you achieve maximum profitability, right? And I think that for everybody who's operating their business, and that's the reason that they're in business, like fuck off. Like that's not right. Like you've completely missed the whole point, like to everything, right? Like that's like or alternatively, I feel bad for those people because like that's how they're spending their time. Like, what could be more misfortunate than to feel like, you know what, the whole purpose of life is for me to try to con whoever I interact with out of their money. Right.
See, I think that's the Machiavellian, like nihilistic take too.
That's exactly the thinking of the customer is always right.
Okay,
right?
That's
just supposed to be this distillation of like a wisdom of how you go about achieving that in an expedient articulation.
The way that I've tried, and I've just, it's one of those phrases I just like think about because it's such a cliche and whatnot. But to me, it's resonated because everything you said, I 100% agree with.
It's okay if
you have to be able to know when to say, you know what? No. You're absolutely right. The distinction I try to make is sometimes you will say that is not my customer.
Yeah.
And that means you're not right.
Yeah, that's a great.
But if I'm going to say
point.
that to you, that means like, well, don't expect me to shop here again.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think if you're,
but you shouldn't be a dick about it.
And if you have like in a situation where that's an option, and I totally agree with you then, right? Because in that scenario, then
the customer,
then
is
the
thing that
customer
allows you to have that communication with the broader entity that you're interacting with,
and implicitly, right, the way that you just framed that, right, if that option's on the table, then what it means in my thinking is that you're occupying a space that suggests that the customer is not this static and fixed thing. It's not a target for extraction, but it's actually something that is amorphous and is kind of a guiding point for keeping you honest and keeping you not invested in the principles.
Like, this is wrong. We're changing this. Like the customer's always right.
Yeah, and if you can create a scenario for yourself where your patronage serves in that manner, right, to keep you honest and to kind of be a check on your integrity and the principles that you're hoping to embody in your work, then yeah, by all means, I'm definitely a supporter of that thinking and that phrase in that scenario.
And we can parallel that back to beer, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
The way that brewers envision their creative respect in how they brew beer and what beers they want to brew isn't necessarily the hottest style, most sought after. And then there's this compromise of we'll do this and we'll add whatever fruit and whatever to make sure that like this is appealing to a broader audience, but it's not the creative vision of what that person wants to do. And there is like a huge dichotomy difference of like, okay, well, I can make 18 Czech lagers and they can all be amazing, but at the end of the day, I have 18 Czech lagers,
right?
And I'll probably go out of business soon.
Yeah,
unless
you're Pilsner Urquell.
Yeah. but there's a lot of conflict there in just deciding as a business how you approach those types of things and what you fold on. And as a member of the nerd community, it's always like the loudest majority or loudest minority, and you're like, why don't you make these barrel aged stouts with vanilla? And like, why wait once a year for this? Like, really? What are you guys doing? And then you realize that it's like 2% of our overall sales for the entire year. And you're just like, but I'm important.
That's a hard line to walk.
Yeah,
and that comes into like another one of those like cliche 80-20 rule type things, is like just knowing like what products are valuable to people. Just like knowing and knowing who's wasting all your time. That's the flip side of the 80-20 rule. Is like 80% of your time will be taken up by 20% of your customers, and
Pareto principle.
The 80% of your profits come from 20% of your customers. There's some overlap there, but it's definitely not a matching Venn diagram or whatever.
Yeah, it's difficult to try to, I think that's one of the things that I try to grapple with, and admittedly try to, as frequently as possible, be stubbornly defiant of, is just this notion that you are obliged to forfeit or forego personal identity, if you will, in exchange for, by one measure, profitability, but by a more charitable and by a more honest, or at least by the other side of that token, right? for existential continuity, right? So
I was going to say for likes.
Yeah, for likes. Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, it's a subsistence of likes.
Yeah, I completely agree. But that resonates back with what you were saying earlier, which is like the product is you.
Yeah.
And that gets lost a lot in corporate America because we talked about Henry Ford earlier. It's in some context, but he put the cog in the machine, and like maybe that was Eli Whitney or whatever. But like humans became parts at some point, and then the question is, what is the machine? And that's the story that we're all trying to figure out now. And the parts are changing very rapidly, and the like owner's manual got like burned sometime back during the Library of Alexandria going down or something. Like we don't have the owner's manual. We're trying to figure
we don't know what
out.
They're doing.
Yeah, the battery is drained right now, especially after the last 2 years.
I think I see a lot of folks who I feel like justifiably kind of rush to criticism of the capitalistic enterprise, and like I share a lot of the distaste for what I think that, at least on the surface, that represents as a philosophy. But there's a really interesting interview from like the early 70s. It's Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault, and he's talking. It's really, really fantastic. There's a section where Noam Chomsky is talking just about, if it's true, as I believe it is, that a fundamental principle or element of human nature is this need for creative inquiry, for creative work, then it will follow that any decent society will maximize the likelihood of mitigating these forces of coercion and oppression and suppression that exist as a kind of historical residue in any society, ours included.
Which is ultimately entropy, like of the universe,
Yeah,
things fall apart.
And I think that, it was really insightful to see that, and to kind of because I've most certainly found myself sympathizing deeply with a lot of those arguments, like I said. And it was really refreshing in that moment to at least feel like I had found a bit of a path to feeling a little bit less benighted and a little bit more kind of like, you know what, this feels like we're actually in the natural sequence of things, right? To feel a little bit more kind of, maybe at home in the universe or in the timeline, if you will, as opposed to just feeling so completely anachronistic and like, well, what the fuck are we doing here? It's like, actually, okay, yeah, it makes perfect sense that an increasing share of folks out there are looking out at the contours and parameters of how sociopolitical power is distributed, and they're saying, well, this is not fucking right.
Right.
Which
was like they were pivotal figures in the existential like movement too, which is just like existence precedes essence. You have to figure that shit out on your own, but that's somewhat, I wouldn't say nihilistic. It's somewhat I don't know. It could feel defeatist, or it could feel ultimately empowering. Yeah. That it's really all about the story that you tell yourself in your own head, which is what your company does.
Yeah. And I don't think that those things has to preclude one another either, right? Like I think that they actually kind of they coexist, and I think they actually critically they like coexist by necessity, not just by chance and not just because we want to say like, oh well, yeah, that's a possibility of worthy of entertaining. I think it is fundamentally an undeniable truth, right? They have to kind of qualify one another.
I completely agree.
And you brought us this beer, but you also brought us the second part of the show and tell, which is an item that is not beer.
One thing beer, one thing not beer.
Yeah.
We've done the beer, which is amazing.
Yeah. So let's see, what did I bring? Okay, so what I brought is a book called Ways of Curating by Hans Ulrich Obrist. He is a Swiss curator, fine art curator, really fantastic. So again, David, you have been participant in a lot of the ways that I have kind of worked to use the work that I do, or have aspired to use the work that I do to promote the development of communities in various ways, especially in physical spaces when I had a little bit more of a direct relationship with programming in some of those spaces. Enthusiastic to probably be reprising some of that work here soon. But this has been a really great book for me. It's really interesting. I'm rereading it right now, and it's really fascinating to look at this guy. On the surface, the thinking it renders as kind of a snooty thing. I was like, oh, this guy's he's a fine art curator. Like, get this guy the hell away from me. But actually, it's really, really lovely. It talks a lot about kind of what's the function of a collection, and very much in the spirit of a lot of the conversation we've had thus far, right? Curation, and really, that can be as simple, especially in my world, as just putting shot
together an
next
A-Late
to
cocktail
another.
menu.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Any two things, whether they are alike, right, or whether they are different, you're effectively making decision to either include or parse away. It results in the construction of meaning, and I think that for me, that's effectively what the whole idea with just how you spend your time and what our kind of mandate in life, whoever we might be, should look like, is like, hey, we have this opportunity to kind of explore this mystery individually, but also this kind of miracle of like, hey, you know what? Weirdly enough, I can just move my fucking face, and your thought or my thought can be marginally, or at least approximately, reconstructed in your brain mind system and yours. Like, we can interact with each other, like. And we so frequently fail to appreciate that the miracle that is, and that we get to not just explore that mystery ourselves, but also, we get to do that collaboratively. And
Over the
internet.
internet.
And over the internet, right? And get to say like, oh yeah, like here's what I got over here. Like, does that check out over there? Does that make any sense? Am I out of my mind? Am I on track? And so curation, just as this kind of as this modality of thinking about things and synthesis of experience, is something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and really trying to wrap my head around, and trying to kind of incorporate as a kind of a meditative practice, or kind of just like a practice of stewardship to others in my life. So that's why I brought that book.
Heck yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a great share.
Yeah.
Never heard of that, but I think might be interested in checking that out.
Is he from Denmark?
He's Swiss.
Okay, never mind.
If my memory serves me correctly. I think he's pretty well circulated on the fine art scene, though. It's short enough read that it's worth the rolling the dice on it.
Find good picture. Put them on wall. He look very good.
Yeah.
Make sure level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We often like talk about like the pulse of beer in the industry. You have a specific knowledge in beverage space. I think I'm taking a little bit away from that and noticing a couple things, but are there any specific trends in beverage that you're seeing? I think personally, I'm thinking of clear spirits coming back into the fold, like
horseradish vodka.
Yeah, maybe more tequila mezcal type deal. And then also Campari. I see it everywhere now. It's just like the coolest thing. But anything you would see as up and coming or trending as far as the industry goes?
Well, so I mean, just not even personal suspicion so much as just the obvious. I mean, this isn't my number to give. It's just a matter of fact that agave is obviously, from a sales standpoint, and domestically, really, its rate of market share grab is becoming outrageous.
Really?
They're starting to dominate. The trend lines are definitely favoring agave.
Just in terms of a fermentable, or is there is that a product?
I mean, just in terms of
Like things
mezcal
that
and
they do with it.
tequila
Okay.
specifically. I'm just using the agave as just the kind of blanket for those two.
Saying sorghum or saying
yeah.
like whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So mezcal and tequila are really
That's
starting
very
to
interesting.
displace, especially a lot of what the American whiskey category has enjoyed over the past handful of years. Not that I think that that enthusiasm for bourbon or for American whiskey is going to disappear or anything, but I think that people are going to be really mad at me for saying this, but I personally prefer tequila is my
Podcast over.
Sorry.
Podcast over.
Yeah, tequila is my spirit of preference personally.
Do
I
you have any
really
idea
love
of,
it.
do you have any theories about why, or just like what's going on?
I don't think a lot of people in these kinds of conversations, I feel like the kind of de facto is to pontificate about, it's here's the reason for this trend. I think it is just social momentum more so than anything. I don't think it's that product or its denomination of origin or the methodology behind it. I don't think there's anything inherently better about that or better about a bourbon or anything. For me, I think that we have these beautiful pockets of culinary and distillation ethnography that these spirit categories represent, and they're all equally worthy of consideration. They're all beautiful.
Yeah.
They're all they have their place. One of the things for me, you talked about clear spirits.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I'm really enthusiastic about, I was just in Montreal a couple of weeks ago, and it got to try a couple of truly fantastic gins that are very much following this kind of trend at the moment of leveraging local botanicals, and that idea of hyper local gins. It's interesting. I'm kind of trying to wrap my head around the market mechanics of it, because unfortunately, the challenge is, hey, how can you make a mass market appeal for a local Montreal gin? So a lot of those distilleries are going to face, well, really your dominant market is going to be local and essentially, your
Regional.
tourist market,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which for me now, anywhere I'm going out of my way to look for a hyper local gin. I got one in Mexico City back in November. That's a prickly pear and rose hip, I think.
So gin does not have to just be juniper.
No, not at all.
Okay.
No,
Yeah,
I had
so-
an aloe gin.
Yeah.
And that was fantastic.
Yeah, the federal standards of identity for gin, and that's domestically, I mean, they're very forgiving. You got a lot of variation that's possible. You don't even actually have to have juniper per se. A lot of people are going to lean into at least using it, even if it's marginally so, because that's what the popular lexicon for gin is, right? So a lot of people are not going to recognize it as gin if you don't have some degree of it.
The corn mash of bourbon.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But especially like in international markets, you have a lot of interesting things. One of our buddies, Brian Downing, he worked with us at El Camino. Worked then after that at Copper and Kings for a little while. Worked with Diageo on behalf of Dickel and Bullet. Did some distillation work through a couple of those professional periods of time, and is now working on behalf of a distillery called Talking Cedar in Washington State. It's the first. I'm sure if you fact check me, I'm sure you could probably get this a little bit more precise, but I believe that the language is something along the lines of it's the first distillery in the States that is fully owned by a native tribe.
Oh, cool.
And they have entrusted him and his background in the distillation space to help them bring that project to life. And one of the first projects he's going to do is, I don't know if I'm allowed to give a lot of detail about it, but it's essentially going to be, there will be gin that will specifically utilize a lot of those crops, specifically what he's trying to, or well, a lot of those botanicals, native botanicals.
I
that
think I know
region.
what you're saying.
Yeah.
And he's trying to also, interestingly enough, I really liked this play. He is looking to emphasize utilization, not just of regional botanicals, but also specifically invasive botanicals to play a role in thinking about the stewardship of the ecological character and quality and integrity of his home.
I wonder if there's any like cultural methods like associated with that. I don't know. But that's a really the first. Yeah, I mean that's an incredible project.
Yeah, it's super cool, and I can't think of anybody who would be more deserving or fitting for that. He's worked really, really hard. He used to tell me at Copper and Kings, I'm not working here because we do things the easy way, and he most certainly put in some great time. Really, really fantastic individual. I'm excited to see what he does with that project.
And that seems like a growing trend in America, at least among the Utes. The Utes such as ourselves, present company excluded, at least me. David's a youngin'. But I don't know, people seem more interested in that than they are in cheap off the shelf stuff these days, which,
Yeah, agreed. I'm
fantastic.
I'm really pleased to see that seems to be the trend in consumer behavior, as being one more towards concern for. I mean, especially in the spirit space. Anytime you're talking about putting a toxin into your body, it's better to have a damn standard. I mean, come on, have some respect for yourself.
yeah, exactly. Only good toxins with a story.
That's right, with a very, very good story.
The most pure.
Yeah. They'll do some other stuff too. That's just kind of one of those kind of bootstrap projects. I don't want to mischaracterize it for him, but reliably, when you're kind of getting a distillery started, the protocol is kind of, hey, let's produce some of the stuff that we can produce quickly, make it possible to do some stuff. But they're already barreling like single malt American whiskeys that they'll obviously will require some maturation, so we won't see those for a little while. But his kind of orientation to thinking about how to innovate in this space and where opportunities are as yet unrealized is really exciting.
Hell yeah.
I think the other thing I've seen is a lot of low ABV stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which you were drinking a mountain water from Highwire earlier about
drinking psilocybin tea.
Right. But it's marketed as a seltzer beer mix, and it just really is refreshing.
Yeah, great. That's a great example too. I hadn't had that before. I'm pleased to see that there are, admittedly, a lot of the seltzers I think are kind of dog shit in my opinion. But
Topo Chico or nothing for me.
That's Topo Chico is a truly phenomenal product. I agree there.
That's kind of the gold standard in my opinion.
I agree.
Yeah, they're doing a good job.
Yeah.
We actually will have a podcast soon with one of the folks that has helped work some in that space.
Bring him over to my house. You can bring him to the bar.
Will do. So for Louisville news for the next couple weeks, we're going right into the Oktoberfest season. So Fall City is going to have their Autofest.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Great beer. Cam does an awesome job with that. It's very caramel forward, very approachable, a little sweetness on it. Against the Grain will also be debuting their Oktoberfest, and that should be available in cans. They have some really cool art that went along with that, and I'm excited to see that come out.
No one thinks about Oktoberfest in August, but you really should be thinking about Oktoberfest in August because it's just around the corner, even though it doesn't seem like it right now, but it's like almost fall, guys. It's almost fall.
And it's over before you know it.
That's right.
You gotta,
especially here.
You got to savor those seasonals. I think last year I spent the most time drinking seasonal beers. I'm like, holy cow, these are all great. And then you kind of like play into the seasonality of it, and it's like, because it's 65 and it's it's just great.
Are you saying you want a pumpkin spice latte? I do right now. Yeah. Pumpkin spice lattes after the podcast in this nice August weather.
There's no shame in a pumpkin spice latte.
This is not a PSA for PSLs. I'm just saying.
Listen, you are not the people who consume the pumpkin spice latte just because you consume the pumpkin spice latte. Okay, don't let people ruin a fantastic experience for you.
I think
I always compare it to a mint julep. Like, I want exactly one pumpkin
Yeah,
spice
there you
latte
go.
every
Perfect.
fall, and I'll enjoy it. And then
See,
I'm like, all right, coffee.
If it's extra sweet, I'll take one daily. It's fine. That's no problem.
I think you and I have had the same conversation about cheeseburgers, but
Sounds about right.
And then next weekend we got the Old Louisville Craft Beer Fest. That all those proceeds go back to the local neighborhood association. It's a great time to come out, pay cover, get in, taste
They did it in
beers from
Central
all-
Park?
Yeah, Central
Yeah.
Park. Come out, taste beers from all over the city, and that's really that's our best park. Maybe.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
If you've not spent much time in Central Park, like, you're surrounded by Old Louisville, and like the part, like basically the coolest little hub of those like old Victorian buildings, which I think is still the largest Victorian neighborhood in the United States, right?
I do believe so.
I think that's correct.
I think so.
Maybe.
We're
We'll just
gonna
go with a
own
maybe
it.
on that.
We're gonna own it.
In
Just say
Minecraft.
definitely 100%,
100%.
no question.
And then you've also got like the beautiful trees, the amphitheater, the little pavilion.
Old
yeah.
Louisville Brewery.
Oh, and all the beer. I should have mentioned the beer too. Like a lot of good beer at the Old Louisville
There you
Beer
go.
Fest. Yeah.
All right. I'll throw it over to John. You got anything to plug?
Oh man, what should I plug this week? I want to plug this. Like, I'm not a gamer. I hardly ever play video games, but I was trying to think of like, I was trying to remember how I used to have fun when I was a kid. And I found a video game that I can't remember the name of, so I'm just going to describe it. But it was on that Steam thing, and you basically get sucked into this like ancient Roman city that like lived inside of a giant sinkhole underground, and you have to kind of work with the.
This isn't Pompeii.
No, it's a
No.
it's a video game. It's all fictional. But anyway, you like play with time, and you have to try to save this like village from destroying itself from violating the golden rule. So anyway, I'm not much of a gamer, but I found a video game that was fun, which is rare for me, and I enjoyed. So shout out to video games.
Tommy.
When does this come out? How soon?
It'll be Monday.
Oh, it'll be too late for one of those. Okay, so a couple
Sometimes we do like
things.
to shout out future, past, present, anything you love. Go for it.
Yeah. All right. So a couple of things coming up. So the 25th of August and the 31st of August is Feast Barbecue's 10-year anniversary. They're having parties at their Nulu and J-Town locations, respectively. Very enthusiastic about that and very pleased to have them as a part of our restaurant scene. They are true gems. I don't have the exact dates for this, but I know that Common House will be doing an Oktoberfest celebration, which should fall in line with kind of exactly where that does in Munich, so mid-September period, and it should be a kind of ongoing
Hell yeah.
thing. I'm always wanted to plug Weightless Float Center.
Oh yes, that's a
Yeah.
good.
Greg.
Yeah, so you can follow them on Instagram or just go in there.
They were the first float center in
sauna,
Louisville, too, if
massage.
I'm not mistaken. There might have been
They're
one
the
more around
only
there.
float center.
Okay,
in
there you go.
Louisville.
That's perfect. That's 100% factual.
There's exactly one float center in this city.
And there's one that I pay a membership to,
Hell yeah.
and it's weightless. So,
And then we have with Kentucky to the World. Let me see here. I'm gonna have to pull this up and make sure I have it right. So on September 27th at the local seltzery, we are going to host a kind of mix and meet with cocktail specials, and we're gonna do actually you can, between now and then, you can actually purchase tickets to our raffle. It's a bourbon raffle for a bunch of rare bottles, 6 bottles. Let me see if I'll get this right. It's gonna be rare bottles from Wild Turkey, Four Roses, Maker's Mark, Parker's Heritage, Foregate, and Woodford. $50 for an entry.
Or as I like to call it, the good shit.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's awesome. You want to pontificate on? We didn't really pontificate on Kentucky to the World. Do you want to do that
Yeah,
for 5
sure.
minutes, real quick?
Yeah.
You're the perfect person to do that too. Just because if you can wrap
Yeah, I
up
can-
what
I can-
Kentucky
I can-
is as a product in your head,
Sure.
how do we pitch that? Because that's a lot of what our mission is as well.
Yeah, so the goal of the organization. So I'm really fortunate to work with this organization. I
We can describe what it is too quickly. It's really it's a nonprofit, or is it?
It's a nonprofit.
It's a nonprofit, really just designed to kind of do exactly what you do. To basically define to people why Kentucky is the coolest place in the entire known universe.
Yeah,
at least the observable part.
Advocate for both the intellectual and cultural reputations of the state. The way we do that is generally by highlighting people of excellence with strong Kentucky ties, so people who have done something exceptional in their own field. No particular limitations or guardrails on what that means from a discipline standpoint. And we, a lot of the times, achieve that primarily through actually live audience speaker series events, as well as through digital media, depending on what a given individual story kind of lends itself to, as well as their accessibility, of course. So I'm really fortunate to work with that organization. These days I kind of work in a couple of different capacities. I kind of play the lead on the creative team, as well as serving as the director of strategic planning. And I am also a member of the board. We're working to grow the footprint of that organization across the state beyond having strictly kind of, technical or personnel here in Louisville. So we've expanded this year into Pikeville, as well as into Bowling Green area. We have strategic partnerships with Western Kentucky University's Innovation Campus. They're actively building a podcast booth that's branded to Kentucky to the World right now that will interface with their media programs. We're really enthusiastic about that. But yeah, the program that we'll have on the 27th is probably going to be about as informal as programming gets with that organization. That will be, again, just kind of a networking thing. We're going to have a lot of our board there, and then we'll do some drink specials, and that will also kind of be the formal drawing of this raffle that we'll be having. We're going to get tickets for that through the website. In the interim, it's kentuckytotheworld.org, and they're $50 per entry. All of the funding that goes to those is fundraising for the organization itself, for sustainability, and also to help us to fund some of the initiatives that we've been working to bring to life. So all very, very positively and well spent money.
Just made me very excited to be a Kentuckian all of a sudden. Yeah,
good. I'm glad to hear it.
If you guys only knew how cool we were around here.
That's
basically.
right.
Darling. Yeah, that's more Tennessee. We just call people by their proper names.
Yeah, like David.
Like David. I call you darling sometimes. Only
Darling
after the
David.
podcast.
It's fine. For me this week, shout out to WorldFest. Gonna be 20 years in WorldFest.
Speaking of like similar ideas, but from a different standpoint.
A little bit differently, but we did engage on a very exciting project with the city. We developed a global dining passport guide. So going around to 30 different restaurants that were ethnic or immigrant owned, celebrating that globalization of Louisville and the city as an immigrant city. I think that often gets overlooked. The city has graciously devoted a department to that, and they reach out to us to, kind of help tell that story with them. So that will be debuting at WorldFest. So if you happen to go, which you should go because it's a great time and great music, great food, great people, pick up a passport and try and get your way around the city, trying out some places that you've literally never heard of, because we hadn't heard of them before we went either.
I will shout out David and Michael on this one. You guys, we had to pick 30. That was the hardest part, honestly.
That was because there's so many.
We had a list of like 200 and something, like 200.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we had to winnow it down to pick 30. We divided it by neighborhood, by cuisine, and you guys did the legwork and went to these places, like met the staff, met the owners, and more importantly, took the food and took very good pictures of the food. I must say, David, your photography skills are stellar. And then turned it into a passport a la Louisville Ale Trail. But
Love it.
Yeah, the food was really phenomenal. I think one thing that stuck with me throughout the whole process was like, now I just kind of look at these like places that I drive past and I'm like, ooh, that might be the one.
The more like hole on the wall.
Yeah, you're like, I don't don't
the more you
know.
celebrate.
And I'm all in for it. But really, Louisville has a super diverse culture as far as food goes,
Yeah.
and it's often overlooked. Going to bigger cities,
Yeah,
and
plug
seeing,
Kentucky Refugee Ministries on top of that.
Yep.
Thank you to them for
100%.
that.
yeah. But that's something to look out for. Hopefully we have a couple of passports to go around for that, and then hopefully that develops into a little bit of bigger project.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
But thank you for joining us this
Yeah,
evening,
dude.
Tommy.
Yeah, this is
Appreciate it.
by
Yeah.
far our most like psilocybin tea based podcast to date. I think it's just Kölsch, guys. It's
Mission
just Kölsch.
accomplished.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Hell yeah, that was fucking awesome.
Well, but I don't push buttons because I tend to delete things.